So the reason why I called this video the shoulder complex is this joint is pretty complex. We're going to be talking a little bit about the clavicle, collarbone through here, the humerus or the arm bone, especially the ball and socket joint in there, and then the scapula or the shoulder blade in the back. So starting with our torso here, you can see on the back there's shoulder blades. The bottom of the shoulder blade, inferior angle, is pretty important. So you can sometimes see that poking out of the shirt when the cue is given, shoulders up, back, and down, or drop your shoulders. It's this part you really want to pay attention to. And ideally, both of the angles are moving down towards the center or towards the sacrum, where all the movement comes from again, down here. So you can try and point the angles at the sacrum. You can sometimes feel this little ridge here, and that's if you go kind of up and over the crest of the shoulder towards the back of the body. You can kind of feel a little bony line right through there, and that's coming into this little ridge along the shoulder blade. That's a little ridge that actually connects to the clavicle. And just in the groove in the little ridge, very important rotator cuff muscle. We'll come to that in the muscle section, but we're going to be looking at supraspinatus a little bit and sort of how that works. And this little guy does a lot of work, so it's often tender. That's where a lot of people feel tightness. So you can notice on this skeleton, like there are in most, that they're quite often stapled to the body. And in a way, that's what happens with the muscles. There's a lot of muscles, again, around this complex that keeps the shoulder attached to the body, connected to the body, but it's not actually connected back here. The only place it's connected is up here, the AC joint or acromioclavicular joint, which really is only connected to the body here in the front in the sternal notch. So you have that little groove here, and just off to either side, you have your end of your clavicle. So the clavicle are kind of chicken wing bone, collarbone goes across, connects to the top of the shoulder, which connects to the back of the shoulder blade and forms a little pocket here where the head of the arm plugs in, or the head of the humerus. So just with the shoulder blade, make sure that the shoulder blade is very, very mobile. It's supposed to slide all over the rib cage. So you should be able to take, maybe you'll feel your shoulders a little bit easier, but your actual shoulder blades in the back should be able to go up, down, in, and out or forward. We tend to do this one a little too much, so retraction is important along with protraction, elevation and depression, but make sure maybe even have a partner try and touch your shoulder blades, because sometimes you can keep your shoulder blade quite stable and just the clavicle, maybe a bit of the muscle tissue and the head of the humerus move, but my shoulder blade doesn't really move. It takes more to get your shoulder blades to actually move back there. So make sure the actual scapula itself is mobile. So we have the scapula, we have the clavicle. Not too much I really want to say about the clavicle at this point, but the clavicle should always be long and lowered. So rather than short and high, which most of us tend to do, this is a common, oh geez, I'm cold, I'm stressed, I'm sad, I'm upset. It tends to be this position. Try and lower and lengthen your collarbones, or that again brings the shoulders back, expands through the chest. We'll talk a little bit more when we get into the muscles of the chest and back and how they work off of each other. So I'll try and balance our torso here for just a moment and take the arm bone, the head of the humerus, and I guess it'd be over on this side of the body, plug them in. And that's basically what it does. There's not a lot of room there. If you remember the hip video, pretty deep socket, pretty shallow socket. So there's goods and bads about this. The goods is that the shoulder is a very mobile joint, not very stable. If you separate your shoulder, not as big of a deal. If you separate, dislocate your hip, big problem. Especially the dislocation coming out of the hip socket, big problem. Here there's technically two different injuries. The separation is technically dropping down away from the clavicle or that AC joint, and then dislocation out of the socket or the head of the humerus comes out. But for our purposes, neither is good. So that plugs in about like so. Then you can have the rest of the body kind of hand sitting over top, the elbow is in there and bending. And for the head of the humerus, just make sure that you're aware of the shoulder is supposed to sit here in the socket. If it's sitting here, it's coming out. So I guess I do need my torso one more time. If you're sitting like this, rounded shoulders, you're kind of most of the way out of the socket already. It needs to come back and actually plug in. Here it's actually back in, and at that point the elbow is pointing straight backwards. So a simple test is just looking where your elbows are hanging out. If you're standing and your elbows are here, not so good. Your elbows should be pointing backwards. This open palm position is anatomical position here with the shoulders back, or long and lowered clavicles. So that's mostly the humerus bone. Most of the rotation should be coming from up here, especially if you're not turning your wrist over. The wrist and elbow are still together, then that's all coming from up here. We can also turn just from the wrist and elbow, while the wrist moves because of the elbow, and that's not the shoulder. So there's two places we can rotate, one up top, and then two, we can rotate here in the actual elbow joint. So the way the radius, or the kind of smaller bone, rotates or rolls, radius rolls, rotates over the ulna to create kind of a crisscrossed position. So most of the time when our palm is down, we actually have this crisscrossed position. So supination, pronation. Sup, you're holding a bowl of soup. Pronate, more like a shoe where your foot is turned over this way. When you overpronate, you're rolling too far in. So just make sure that when we're working with bearing weight, this is the way that we're more stable and secure. Once we roll over, where we spend most of our time, we've now created a crisscross and we're not quite as stable or anatomically sound. Totally fine, we do it lots, but just be careful of how you bear the weight. And then you're not taking it in the shoulders unless you're intending to. The shoulders should more or less remain in their sockets, and then this movement can happen down here. The ulna, or the more medial bone, is the one that actually creates the olecranon process, or the tip of the elbow back here. So that elbow point is actually part of your arm bone that runs down towards your pinky. Our ulna is a little more medial, more towards the inside. Radius is more lateral to the outside. One of the ways you can remember that is when someone asks you where your radius is, just tell them it's a rad bone and it's out here by your thumb. And or the other way I remember it is my ulna is medial. Whenever someone asks me, I always have to pause and think for a moment. Ulna medial. So they come down and join into the wrist. We'll do a separate video on wrists and fingers because it's a fairly complicated joint down there. So let's just make sure we're aware of the head of the humerus, the elbow, ulna, radius, how those things rotate, and then clavicle, scapula, and that humerus upper arm bone plugs into the little socket. Hopefully a mobile socket. Very mobile, not so stable, so we got to work on stabilizing this one, and back down in the hips, the other ball and socket joint, we got to work on mobilizing.